Alter Rebbe had a chassid who was called the Yoshiv. And the translation of the word Yoshiv means the one who sits. But he wasn't called Yoshiv because he would sit around. He was called Yoshiv because he had an interesting tendency, which was that anything that occurred in his life, he would say, "Medaf sich meyashav zayin." And he meant by saying "Medaf sich meyashav zayin" means I want to think about it. I want to analyze it. I want to delve into it. I want to break it apart and so forth. And of course, the story was that he had a yechidus with the Alter Rebbe as a young man. And the Alter Rebbe told him that anything that you do during your lifetime, darf man sich meyashav zayin. You have to contemplate. You should never do things impulsively. Everything should be thought through. This man lived, through 3 Rebbes. He was a chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek, and he was still saying, if you asked him if he wanted breakfast, he would say, "Medaf sich meyashav zayin." You want to put on a new shirt, "Medaf sich meyashav zayin." You want to take a walk, "Medaf sich meyashav zayin." This story reflects a philosophy of life that I suppose in the fast food world we would call a very deliberate and patient world, a very contemplative kind of a world. We're always on the run, and much of what we do is impulsive. Chassidim in the olden days used to say, "Va'avadetem meheira," medaf ma'abed zayin mehirus, which translates in English, "Va'avadetem meheira" is words from the Shema, but it's taken out of context and translated to mean we have to rid ourselves of our tendency towards being hasty. In human nature, impulsiveness and compulsiveness are part of the condition. And to be a pnimi, to be a real person, it becomes necessary to be much more deliberate, and ultimately to be absolutely deliberate. The point is that there is something to be said about slowing down. There's something to be said about limiting yourself. There's something to be said about departmentalizing things and having time and a space for everything. To say this in philosophical language, which is what our Maamar is about, there is something to be said about limitation. Limitation, division, order are, from the perspective of infinity, limitations. But there is something extraordinarily significant about things being limited, especially in as much as the purpose of creation is concerned. In the framework of the purpose of creation, in order to properly accomplish what creation is about, beginning from the very idea of creation itself and then fulfilling creation's purpose, it's all about limitation. In the very introduction to the Hayom Yom, you have a letter from the Rebbe Rashab, from the previous Rebbe's father, where he talks about Yitas Kislev. It's a very powerful letter, a very poignant letter, a very emotional letter. And in this letter, he tries to describe what Yitas Kislev is and what Chassidus is, and how Chassidus is about fulfilling the inner purpose of the creation, and it involves refinement of character and so forth and so on. And he finishes off by saying, Yashar Yechazu Fanemei. The translation of these words, Yashar Yechazu Fanemei, means Yashar, go straight. Yechazu means you'll see. Fanemei. Fanemei means the face of God. The concept behind these words, Yashar Yechazu Fanemei, means that if you walk straight, and walking straight actually means walking in the middle of the road, you'll meet the face of God. The philosophy or the mysticism behind that is that when you're walking straight, walking in the middle of the road, you're not being polar. You're not being extreme. You're not doing radical things. Now, normally, when we talk about meeting God, with what's called in the yeshivish world, atzmos, we think of tshuva. We think of radical Judaism, of Judaism that involves compensation and overcoming obstacles and the struggles and all of that. You want to reach atzmos, you have to have something extreme, and the extreme requires an enemy, an opposition, which brings out those extremes. But in this letter, he quotes and explains the pasuk, Yosh Yachsam, just walking in the middle. Yachaz of Anemu brings you in touch with Pnimis V'atzmas Ein Sof. I don't want to get very carried away with the philosophy of it. But in short, the philosophy is that even though walking in the middle of the road is so limited and so reasonable and so orderly, the posit is, by walking in the middle of the road in a reasonable and limited way, you will reach the Eibishter himself, because there is something about finity, something about order and containment, which allows you to reach Pnimis V'atzmas Ein Sof, the very highest levels of truth, the highest levels of godliness. The Maamar we're going to be learning tonight argues the case for limitation and complexity, or complexity and limitation. And the two are very, very interconnected. Complexity means you have more than one. Anytime you have more than one, there's going to be a limit, because when you have more than one, when you have a hybrid, two things together, they cancel each other out in part. They offset one another. For something to be infinite, it has to be simple, it has to be one. Because when it's simple and when it's one, it can be extreme, what we call often in our discussions polar. The argument of this Maamar is everything about reality, everything about the purpose of reality, and everything about the Torah, which is the source of reality, is about limitation and complexity. And the purpose of creation is achieved. You reach Pnimis V'atzmas Ein Sof through the complexity and limitation that is the reality on its various levels. So let's explore this a little bit more. I want to ask you a question. I've been traveling recently, and I've used this form as a way of making a point about Shalom Bayis. Here's the question. What is the opposite of peace? Of course, what you're supposed to say is war. That's the instinctive response. What is the opposite of peace? But if I intended for you to say war, I wouldn't have asked the question. Just by the fact that I'm asking the question, it's quite obvious I want a different answer. And the answer that I want to propose is the opposite of peace is evasion or avoidance. I'll explain to you what I mean. What are the requisites of peace? What do you need in order to have shalom? You need to have conflict. You can't have peace if you only have one. Peace with oneself is not peace at all. In psychology, a person has to be at peace with himself, but that's because people are complex. But singularity, oneness, aloneness doesn't warrant peace because there's no conflict. So the very idea of peace is only applicable, is only true when you have a conflict, diversity, more than one. You bring them together, you create a unity, and then you have peace. And of course the argument is that the peace brought into the complexity and to the diversity is a higher idea than a peace because you only have one. So when you have different things, you have conflict. When you create peace within a conflicted situation, that is a much more meaningful concept of peace. But it's peace that can only be manifest in complexity and limitation. In simple infinity, is a different concept of peace. It's not a real concept of peace. It's a peace by lack of conflict. When you have conflict, and therefore when you have limitation, you have a much more profound concept of peace. In other words, in order to have peace, you have to have a minimum of two things. Because if you have only one, there's no conflict, no possibility for peace. This Maamar is going to discuss this idea, but it's not going to use the number 2 as its base number. It's going to use the number 6. The reason it's going to use the number 6 is because there are 6 primary emotions. There are 6 spheres of Atzilus: Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. And each one of these 6 spheres by themselves is infinite. Kindness alone is infinite. Severity alone, exactitude alone is infinite. Compassion, beauty, joy alone is infinite. And the same is true of determination, the same is true of stubbornness, the same is true of connectedness, which is how I translate Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. If you don't like my translations, sorry, you can't argue with me. You can scream at the computer, but I can't hear you, so you're not going to score any points. Okay. Chesed is kindness, Gevurah is exactitude, Tiferes is beauty or joy, Netzach is stubbornness. I'm sorry, Netzach is aggressiveness. Hoid is stubbornness. And Yossi is attachedness, connectedness. But okay, each one of these midas is infinite. You know what that means in other words? That each one of these midas is useless. Infinite kindness cannot function, cannot be. Infinite kindness is a concept. Infinite exactitude, infinite perfection or judgment cannot exist. So in order for the 6 midas to be functional, quote, in a world, they need to be offset, they need to be balanced, they need to be limited. How? By joining each midah with a counterpart. So when you join each midah with a counterpart, you complicate each midah, but part of the effect of that complication is chesed is no longer only chesed. So therefore, it's not infinite chesed. So it becomes functional chesed. It becomes chesed you could use. When chesed is offset by a little bit of gevura, in other words, there's judgment, there's measure, there's considerations applied to the kindness. That kindness is functional kindness. And the same is true when you mix gevura with chesed and vice versa, and so forth. So this Maamar talks about 12, and the idea of 12 is it's 2 times 6. 6 are 6 absolute midas, attributes. Each one by themselves is infinite, and therefore in the reality of the world, meaningless, functionless, purposeless. And by mixing them with a counterpart, you limit them, you complicate them, you make them functional. So our Maamar is going to argue the case for complexity and limitation and order, because that's what a world is. That's what a reality is. That's what fulfilling a purpose of a reality is. That's what the vision of the Torah is, and so forth and so on. And let me give you another piece of philosophy. I believe that in an earlier Maamar we used this allusion, but let me use it again. When Kabbalah wants to use a metaphor for infinity versus affinity, what metaphor do they use? And of course the answer is, when Kabbalah wants to use a metaphor for infinity, they use the metaphor of a circle or a point. It's not very different. When Kabbalah wants to use a metaphor for affinity, it uses the metaphor of a line, or to be more precise, a variety of lines. Actually 3 lines that cross one another. Why a circle and why a line? A circle is a metaphor for infinity because it has no middle, no beginning, and an end. Infinity has no middle, no beginning, and no end. Infinity is represented by a line or a series of lines because a line does have a beginning and a middle and an end. And if you have more than one line, not only do you have a beginning and a middle and an end in terms of, vertically, so to speak, but you also have a beginning and a middle and end horizontally. The interconnectedness between one line and the other line further complicates the limitation. So when you want to give a mashal for Ein Sof, use a circle. When you want to give a mashal for Gevul, you use a line. Now, arguably, a circle is greater than a line. In other words, infinity is more than infinity. That's common sense, that's obvious, that's a simple truth. But there's another perspective. And the other perspective is that a circle has no mouth. A circle has no point of exit or entry. Circles don't do anything. They just are. Like the Rashi brings in Chumash, that when a person was an oval, they would eat lentils, or they would eat some other kind of a bean, or eggs, for example, that has no opening. That's a perfect globe, a perfect ball, like an oval, like a mourner, she'en le peh, that cannot speak. In Kabbalah language, the circle is also called katnus, katnut, immaturity, lack of development. In other words, infinity is infinite, and infinity is a point. A point meaning to say it cannot interact with things outside of itself because of its infinity. So, in other words, it's almost as if you were to say infinity can become a prison. That's why in Kabbalah and in Chassidus, when we talk about God, we're careful not to call him infinite, we're careful to call him everything, or Ein Sof, which includes finity as well as infinity. The reality is finite. And the reality is finite, number one, for it should be functional, and number two, that through that finity you're going to reveal something which is even higher than what is infinite, which is in effect how infinity can speak, how something which is infinite can actually be manifest, be expressed, or to use a fancy word, how something which is infinite can be bepnimius, can relate to something outside of itself and enter into a vessel, and so forth and so on. This is only possible when you overlap infinity with finity. Let us now begin to learn our Maimed. But I want to say a few things before I start. Number one, there are notes here from the Tzemach Tzedek. And for reasons that I don't know, the Tzemach Tzedek does not put his notes in parentheses. He just puts them into the text itself. We are, as is our custom, not going to learn the Tzemach Tzedek's notes. Don't get frustrated. The fact that it's missing the parenthesis doesn't make it the Alter Rebbe's. It's clearly the Tzemach Tzedek's notes because it is in the style of the Tzemach Tzedek, repeated, multiple sources and arguments and counter-arguments and questions and answers. That's number one. Number two, this is actually a Maimed and a Biur, which means a short essay, a short discourse, which Alter Rebbe could have said in as little as 5 or 7 minutes, and then a commentary on it. Just a story, just a Geshmak HaMaaseh, it's a story. The Mittler Rebbe was literally obsessive about Chassidus. I mean, his whole life was Chassidus. His obsession about Chassidus was so intense that his son-in-law and successor, the Tzemach Tzedek, said that if you would cut the finger of the Mittler Rebbe, blood wouldn't flow, Chassidus would flow. And he tried to impress on people that he wasn't just saying this, as they say in Yiddish, als a gleichwertel, as a cliche, to be cute. His entire identity, his life, his vitality itself was Chassidus. And there are many stories that underscore the degree to which he was so Chassidus obsessive. You know, his father came to him with a proposal for a shidduch, and his father said, we have one shidduch, and a second shidduch, and a third shidduch. Which would you like to pursue? And he answered, whichever girl is willing to marry me the soonest, because I know that when I get married, you'll say extra Chassidus. Now, that is a very, very interesting reason to get married, but the Mittler Rebbe was a very interesting man. But the story that I want to share with you is as follows. The Alter Rebbe would say a Maimed on a Shabbos, on a Yom Tov, on an occasion. And as a rule, there was no contiguousness. There was no connection between one Maimed and another Maimed. In other words, he said a Maimed on an individual Shabbos, the following Maimed there'd be the following Shabbos there'd be a new Maimed, and there was usually no relationship. The later Rabbi, the Rebbe once said that this idea was initiated by the Rebbe Marash, introduced what's called a hemshech, a series of Maimonim. And a series of Maimonim means you're saying a discourse that goes on for pages and pages and pages and pages over weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, connected to something at the very outset. The Alter Rebbe didn't do this at all. Alter Rebbe would say Maimonim on a given Parsha, on a given event, and then just move along. Now what happens if the Alter Rebbe said a Maimed and people did not understand? So they would come to the Alter Rebbe and they would tell him, we don't understand. The Alter Rebbe would say what was called a biur, a clarification, an enlightenment, a further edification of the earlier discourse. What happened if they didn't understand the biur either? So they would again approach the Alter Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe would provide what we would call a biur lib biur, a commentary on a commentary, and so forth. So the Alter Rebbe said a Maimed, Mittler Rebbe didn't understand it. He comes to his father, the Alter Rebbe, and says, I don't understand the Maimed. Would my father perhaps give commentary? And the Alter Rebbe did not respond. So the Mittler Rebbe became physically ill, physically sick, because of from the lack of clarity in Chassidus withdrawal. That's a very great issue that many psychiatrists deal with, is people discovering withdrawal from, people who don't have enough new Chassidus, God forbid the old, So the Alter Rebbe's Rebbetzin, the Mittler Rebbe's mother, came to him and said, you're a cruel man. Your son wants Chassidus. What's he asking you for? He wants Chassidus. You have Chassidus. Give him Chassidus. So the Alter Rebbe chuckled and he said, Zog berel azozach nit zogen sit zayn der bier. Tell my son, the Mittler Rebbe, he shouldn't worry. I'll give him the explanation that he wishes. But this is part of the design of my Mori Chassidus, that you have a Maimed and a biur. The Maimed is very short. The Maimed is all told 19 lines. And the biur, without getting into all the issues of the Tzemach Tzedek's notes, is I guess 130 lines, but there were extensive notes, which puts me in a funny position. I cannot teach, the Maimed this week and the biur next week. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to do the Maimed itself, and the more philosophical part of the biur, which means to say, the part of the biur that addresses the mysticism of the link between limitation and complexity. That's the way to understand what we're about to learn. There's finity and infinity. Limitation, something which is limited, something which is infinite. A byproduct of something being infinite is that it's one, singular and polar. And a necessary component of something being limited is that it has different aspects. Because the simple fact that you have different aspects means that the different aspects relate to each other. And the different aspects' relationship with each other means that on some level they offset one another. And that's how limitation is created. So let's learn the Maamar. Okay? It's a Maamar from Parshas Massei that discusses the borders of Eretz Yisrael. The pasuk very, very carefully and in a detailed way delineates the entire border of Eretz Yisrael. It starts from, I guess, southeast, and he goes to southwest. He climbs along the coast from southwest to northwest, and he climbs from northwest to northeast, and then he trickles his way down from northeast to southeast, and he finishes off in the Yam HaMelech, which is the place where he started. These are the precise borders of Eretz Yisrael. Parenthetically, tangentially, the Sefer of Yehoshua, the book of Joshua, has detailed maps of a similar type about the division of the land into 12 portions, the section that was given to each Shevet, to each tribe. And it's understood from the Gemara that this very detailed division of the territories within Eretz Yisrael makes the book of Yehoshua, Sefer Yehoshua, the legal deed, the legal shtar of ownership to the land of Eretz Yisrael, to the Holy Land. And in a concise way, in a very, very abbreviated way, you have this in our Parsha, Parshas Massei, that gives us the borders of Eretz Yisrael. But the Alter Rebbe analyzes the pasuk, or two of the pasukim actually, that talk about Eretz Yisrael's borders and explains it mystically. Notice the word border. And border and limitation will be argued to be one and the same thing. And what I am telling you by way of introduction, and it'll become clear as we learn, is that this idea of border, idea of limitation, is anchored in the idea of complexity, more than one thing being discussed together. So here we go. Veyarad Hagvul, the border will continue to descend downward. The Torah describes the borders of Israel. Southeast to southwest, southwest to northwest, northwest to northeast, and then down from northeast to southeast. And the pasuk is describing this return, this descent. Veyarad Hagvul, the border will descend, umacha, and will bang against al ketef yam kineret kedem, the shoulder of the sea of Galilee, as people call it, but it's also called the Kinneret, or what is called Genoiser, Kedma to the east, V'gomer, and so forth. In other words, the eastern border of Israel is flanked by the Yarden, by the River Jordan. But the River Jordan has what is called a Yam. We translate a Yam as a lake. In the north, called the Kinneret, and the Yam in the south, which is called the Yam HaMelech. Now, the word Yam is used for an ocean and for a lake, and they're considerably different. The reason they use the same word for an ocean and for a lake is because what they have in common is that it's water that's sitting in a basin, in a bowl. The bowl may be 100 feet across, the bowl may be several miles across, and the bowl may be 10,000 miles across. It's the same principle. The water is sitting in one place. That's what the word Yam connotes, a gathering of water, and a sifas mayim into one mikveh, into one collection. So the pasuk says that the border of Israel is east of the Kinneret. In other words, the Kinneret is inside Israel's border. So the border would go east of the Kinneret and bang against the eastern border of the Kinneret, which means that the Kinneret was to the west, included in the land of Eretz Yisrael. So the Lashon HaPasuk will hit Al Ketef, the shoulder of Yam Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Kinneret, came to the east. And then it says, Veyarad Hagvul, the border will extend further beyond the Yam Kinneret, HaYarden, to the river Jordan, V'chulu, and so forth. Now the river Jordan is not a lake, it's not a sea, it's a river. And rivers are different than seas because seas sit in one place. And rivers flow from one place to another. And what this Maamar is opening up for us is the notion of the limitation of a sea, of a Yam, and the limitation of a Nahar, or of a river. That there is Gvul. Now, in context, Gvul means a border. In other words, the literal, the biblical intent on the basic level. These psukim is to describe borders, but the Rebbe doesn't use the translation border. He uses the translation limit. and that there's a limitation associated with yam, even though yam is like an infinity, there's a limitation associated with it, its relationship with the world, and there's obviously a limitation in a river, which is like a line, has a middle, a beginning, and an end. Says the Rabbi Hine, Bechinas Yardin Uzeh, what is the concept of the river? Jordan, the Gemara says, a completely obscure Talmudic allusion becomes the basis for a mystical commentary on a pasuk in Chumash. Every yeshiva bacha learns Elam Metzias, and you have over there the occasion where the Gemara addresses the question of Yiyush, right? Yiyush means Vaida lechasar and kiss. I own something and I lost it, and you found it. At what point does it become yours? It doesn't become yours when you find it. It only becomes yours when I give up hope of ever retrieving it. It's called yiyush, despair. Now, if I say I don't give up ownership, I intend on finding it, then even though you found it, halachically it isn't yours. And even if I would later be meyayish, if I would later declare despair, I would later say, I'm never going to find it again. Since you picked it up prior to the yish, there's no mechanism which you can acquire it. If you gave it to somebody else, they would be koine it with yish v'shina reshus. You wouldn't. So if I say I don't accept that I lost this item, I intend on retrieving it, what is the halacha then? Of course, the answer is halacha then is that it doesn't belong to the finder, but there's an exception. And the exception, of course, is mizutesh yamash lusa shel nar. When something is lost in a flood, in a natural disaster, in something very extreme, like, for example, a Holocaust. Somebody finds a book after the Holocaust that has the name of somebody's great-grandfather. And the person claims that it's mine. According to halacha, even something with a siman, after an extreme natural disaster, there's a presumption of yiyush. Everybody has given up hope of ever retrieving anything else, so even if it has a name, halachically it belongs to the finder and not to the loser. So the pasuk describes the Yarden flooding the banks of the river and taking a beach chair from Reuven's backyard and putting it into Shimon's backyard. And even if it has a siman on it, if it's clearly identified as Reuven's, it belongs to Shimon's because under those conditions there's a presumption of yiyush. That is the halachic context of this Maamar Chazal, of this Braise, and it uses the word Yarden, the river Jordan. It could be any river. But the Alter Rebbe says that there's something mystical about this. And what's mystical about it is that the river Jordan, and although arguably it's true of all rivers, but in this context we speak specifically about the river Jordan, has the role of taking from one and giving to the next. In other words, you have two psukim that both delineate gavul, limitation. The first one speaks about Yam Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. Again, it's a lake. It's a big lake. It's not an ocean. But it's considered like a yam because the waters are staying in one place, as opposed to the Yade, the river Jordan, that flows one place to another and takes from one and gives to the next. The difference between the two is that yam is a model for holiness, the collection of godly waters, which is infinite. The Yarden, the Jordan's taking from one and giving to the next, is a model for taking from what is klipa and transforming it into kedusha. Avedis habirudim. So the Maimon is going to argue, Yam Kinneret, godliness in its purest form needs gavul, limitation, otherwise it has no relationship to the world. Yarden, which represents the idea of taking from klipa and giving to the shus of kedusha, requires limitation, otherwise it's not functional. And that's the philosophical framework around which this Maimon is built. And here we go. Pirush, the idea of the river Jordan in the mystical context, although the simple allusion of the Gemara to Yarden is, of course, about Yiyush, but something being taken from your possession and carried away to somebody else's possession. Mystically, it's about taking from Klipa and giving to Kedusha. Hu inyan halam imatalamaylas, to raise up. Taking something that is low and raising it higher. Lahalois, to lift up. Mehashvira, for what has been shattered. Mishiyure melacham detaya, from the residue, from the leftover, from the trace of the kings of the polar world of Elamateu, that of course sparks, as you know, fell from that shvira and they got lost and entangled and concealed by klipa, and by themselves shalei nizbarer, that lack a clarity, shu'inyan klipas neiga, which is the notion of what klipa means. Klipa means the spark of God which is trapped. So prior to birur, prior to its release, to its being clarified, it's stuck in klipa. And the function of the yadin, metaphysically, is lahapum to kedusha, to transform them into holiness, which is taking them from one place and putting them into another place. This means, in other words, the Yarden flanks Eretz Yisrael. The river Jordan sits on the border of Eretz Yisrael. Now, the border of Eretz Yisrael would one day be a holy land, but initially it was the land of the Canaanites. So the idea of the Yarden is to take what belonged to Canaan and give it to what belonged to the Jewish people. That you have Zayin, Midas, Shnaflubal Klipas. There are 7 attributes that have fallen into Klipas, which are represented, of course, by the 7 nations of Canaan. And the father of Canaan is Chum. Remember? Noach had 3 sons. Chum was the corrupt of Noach's children. Canaan was his 4th child. So Canaan, which was really 10 nations or 7 nations who were all descendants from Chum. And the mysticism is that Chum represents Chamimus, passion. And from the passion of Chum comes various forms of passion. Lust, hate, anger, violence, and so forth. 7 midas rois. Sheidish Zayin midas rois, the root of the 7 negative attributes of Eretz Canaan, represented by the land of Canaan, which is klipa prior to its transformation, prior to its clarification and uplifting and refinement, and including in the world of Kedusha and so forth. So the Yarden is taking from Canaan and making it into Yisrael. And in order for the Yarden to effectively take from Canaan and to make it into Yisrael, it needs to have Veyarad Hagvul. The last means that to transform this into Hachamimus Gufa, to a passion for godliness of Reshpeh Rishpayesh, a fire, an intense fire for godliness. In other words, Hislavos Halev La'avedas Havaya, the passions of the heart for the service of God Almighty. That's the mystical concept of the river Jordan. Takes from one and gives to the other. From the bottom of the top is based from the arousal from below, and so forth. Says the Rebbe, that's the concept of the reality. There's a real world, and in the real world there's klipa, and in the real world you take from klipa and give to kedusha. The premise of the world, first of all, and then the premise of taking from klipa within that world and giving it to kedusha is complexity and limitation. In other words, things are limited, but the reason they're limited is because they have more than one aspect. And by having more than one aspect, each aspect offsets the other aspect. They're complicated, they complement and compromise one another. At the same time, it creates the reality where you can take from one and give to the next, which is Shuvav Katzavi, which is the concept of 6 dimensions, 6 sides. Uba Avoida Zu, and when one is engaged in a service that involves complex, limited things, Mukhrach Liyas Shinuyim, there are going to be variations, because if you have more than one, you have different blends, right? 40% of one, 60% of the other, 30% of one, 70% of the other. And of course, if you have more than 2, if you have many, and of course, Kabbalistically, we're beginning with 6, the variety, the diversity is ultimately more and more and more and more and more, and all that diversity creates complexity and containment and limitation, and that's a world. A world is a world because it's complicated and because it's limited. It's like a human body. A human body is a human body because it doesn't have only 248 heads. It has 1 head and 2 arms and 2 legs and 2 eyes. The variety and the relative relationships between the next, a human being, God forbid, is missing 1 tiny piece of his body. Everything else is offset. That's complexity and containment, limitation. It's a world. It's a functional reality. And in that kind of an environment, you can take from Kalipa and give to Kedusha. And as I told you before, Yossi you can actually meet godliness through that kind of an endeavor. Machmas shinuye dvarim hatachtainim. When you're dealing with a complex world, there's change. So if in the world there's change and you're avoided, there's going to be change. The inyane gufnim, physical things, of achila and shetiya, v'chulu, of eating and drinking and so forth. So, if I had to put it to you in my own words, here's what I would say. Number 1, the world is a complicated and limited place. If it would not be complicated, then it wouldn't be limited, it wouldn't be a world. It wouldn't be a reality. Number 2, within the framework of that complex, contained reality, there is birur. Natal mizev and nasal lazeh. You take one aspect of the limited realm that is Kalipa, struggle with it, crack the shell or the peel, if you will, clarify the godliness, release the goodness, bring it into the Rishus of Kedusha. This is only possible, first of all, because the world is limited, and second of all, because the effort of transformation is complex and limited as well. So there's the world, and then there's the Birurim, but then there's a third thing. And the third thing is Yiddishkeit. Yiddishkeit is also complicated. Yiddishkeit is also a world. There's 613 mitzvahs, not one. It's a body, it's a whole. And Yiddishkeit also, because of its complexity and containment, because of its limitation, we can do it. We can be changed by it, we change it through our efforts, and of course we and Yiddishkeit change the world. This wouldn't be possible if it were simple and infinite. And that's what he says now. Which is Lamayla Mizeh. There's another model for the same, where complexity and containment allows for godliness to manifest in the world. So model A is the reality itself, Vav K'tzavos of Elam. Model B is the clarifying the entanglements within that complex, contained reality. And model 3 is the complex and contained nature of Torah, which is above the world, that allows the Torah to enter into the world. This is called infinite love. In other words, this is not common. Love from physical things, such as Cham Avi Canaan Hanal, like the idea of Cham, who was the father of Canaan, as we mentioned earlier. In other words, the passions of materialism that exist because of their complexity and containment, which is level 1, which is later going to be clarified, which is level 2. Now we're dealing with another complex, contained model, which also is a world and also relates to the world, but it's above Klipa and it's Bidur. That is Teda Mitzvahs. It's altogether above the world. I'm reading line 9. The world, Teda, was created 2,000 years before the world. Stop right there. The very statement, the Teda was created 2,000 years before the world, as opposed to saying simply, Teda was created before the world, means that the before of the Torah is in relationship with the world. 2,000 years is a measure of some sort. That complexity makes Torah relevant and Torah useful. Simple infinity is useless. In Torah also there's passion. But Torah's passion is not transformative. I'm taking negative passion, making it into positive passion. Torah's passion is ideal. It's a passion of godliness itself. Which is the concept of the Holy Land, as opposed to the land of Canaan. Before the Birur, Canaan is Klipa. During the Birur, you're transforming Klipa into Kedusha, and tangentially, a beautiful Chab. Canaan is the name of a place, right? Whereas Canaan, it's a nation, it's a land, it's a people, it's an environment, it's a time and place in history, and so forth. But one of the translations of the word Canaan is a Seicher. That means, say, a merchant. You have in Chumash, Yehuda went away from his brothers. Vayerad ad ish Knani, he met a man of Canaan, says Rashi, Tagar, a merchant. In Eishes Chayil also, the woman of valor refers to a merchant, a trader, as Canaan. And of course in Kabbalah and Chassidus, this is interpreted to mean buying and selling, taking from Klipa and giving it to Kedusha. So there's two ideas. Canaan the Klipa, Canaan the merchant who takes from Klipa and gives to Kedusha. And then the third thing is Yisrael. Yisrael means ideal godliness removed altogether from Klipa, removed even from the clarification of Klipa, but it also is complex and contained, in other words, limited and involved, and that's why it has relevance to our reality. And this is called Eretz Yisrael. So you have Canaan, and Yisrael. The Klipa of Canaan, the Bidder of Canaan, and then Yisrael. The idea of Eretz Yisrael is that the eyes of God are upon it. And he translates, what does eyes mean? Bechinas Chochma, the level of Chochma associated with the eyes. In other words, that even though Shehi Alpalev, Alpayim, Shana, it's 2,000 years before the creation. Alef Chochma, Alef Chabina, 1,000 years for Chochma, 1,000 years for Bina. And Chochma and Bina represent the Torah. The Ahavazu and this love, Hirak, Maila, comes directly from above, it comes from the Neshama. In In other words, the passions of godliness removed from any struggle of negativity comes from Aaron HaKohen. Through Aaron HaKohen, who's our representative in our relationship with God Almighty. He brings on an infinite love, a simple love, a pure love from above, to the queen. Hanal is mentioned before, Viduk, this means us. So Aaron gives us an infinite love. So an infinite love has to do with a person who has no struggle with the Yetzer Hara. But the very experience of the infinite love, and specifically the fact that we define the experience of the infinite love as being passion. Passion is a relationship to what I'm passionate about. And in this case, it's God, the world, and me, makes this simple, transcendent connection to Hashem also complex and contained. Va'af ha'avu. Now he goes back. We have three models of a world of complexity and containment, of more than one thing creating a limitation. The world, the beater of the world, and Torah, which is above the world. In each case, it's relevant and real because of all of the above. Says the Rebbe, just as the simple relationship with God, which is above the struggle, is limited and has a relationship with the world, but its source is higher. So va'af ha'ava, even the love, which is hidden in the world. In other words, the way godliness is in Klipa, Knan, and you're only going to extract it through a struggle. You shouldn't think that the world by itself provides the impetus and the energy for this transformation. Goyim eat, and they don't automatically raise up their food. So not every time every person partakes of Gashmias is he raising it up. It's not transformed into holiness. We learn from this that it's not every time every human being partakes of Gashmias as he raises it up, there's a struggle. And if there's a struggle, it needs a koyach from outside. Light comes from on high. To give us the possibility to transform and to uplift the negative attribute traits, Likudusha, and make them into the realm of holiness. So just as the ideal complexity and containment of Yiddishkeit is above creation, the koyach for birurim comes from above creation as well. This is the pshat. Veyarad Hagvul. Limitation must descend. Hayardena, to affect the function of the river Jordan, which is to take from Klipa and give to Kedusha. If you don't have containment, you don't have limitation. In other words, if the Yarden is infinite, it can flood, but it can't transfer. It can't take from one and give to the next. Umocha, and it will bang against Al Ketef, the shoulder, the back. Yam Kinneret, the river, the Sea of Galilee, Kedma, which is to the east. V'chulu. Now we're talking about Yam, the sea, as opposed to the river. And this, of course, is an allusion to godliness that's removed from the struggle. As he says immediately, Kinneret Motok Kinner. The word Kinneret means sweet as a kinner. Now, many people translate the kinner as a violin. Kinner means a harp in all likelihood, or some kind of ancient string instrument. So everybody knows that the kinner is very sweet, but as it says later on in the Maamar, if I'm not wrong, that kinner has to do with gevura. Kinneret, the female, for kinner means sweet, like the music of a fiddle or the music of a harp, and so forth. So Yam Kinneret means the sea of sweetness. The sea of sweetness means the sea of something which is sweet without a struggle. So Yarden represents correction through struggle. Yam Kinneret represents correction of being above struggle. And in both cases it says Gevul. The reality of this world, reality by definition, is complex and contained. For Yarden to exist, you have to have Veyarad Hagvul. For Yam Kinneret to exist, you also need Veyarad Hagvul. That Bechinas Chasadim, the level of kindness, Yatsa Me'edin, comes forth from the source of all sweetness, which is Chachma V'dalo, and so forth. And the real source of Kinneres, the real source of the natural godliness, which is also limited but naturally godly, is Mikedem Loin. This is the continuation of the pasuk. Veyarad Hagvul Hayadena, Umochal Keter Kinneres Kedma, Mikedem La'ayin. Now Mikedem La'ayin means before the spring. It's a physical marker. But according to Kabbalah, Mikedem means higher than what you're able to see. Kedem means before, Aya means visual, which is chokhmah. In other words, where does kineret come from? Where does godliness, complex and contained form, have its roots in mikedem lahayin, higher than the, which means in other words keser. It's even higher than the concept of eyes. In other words, that Yam Kinneret, the river of the Kinneret, which is Yam Ilah supernal sea, is Bechinas Nekudim, is a level of a keser, and you're bringing down Gvul from even higher than it. And Vayadin Bechinas Napachni Chuchin, and the concept of Yadin is the transfer, the clarifying and extracting and transferring Klipa, the 248 sparks, Shabaklipas Noiga, Sheyardu B'Shvira, which have been lost through the initial shattering of the sparks of Teyu, where the Eibishter created the world, and bringing them over to Kedusha. But you must know, Aval Sharsham Kedem Shvira Shamu Sharsham. The real sources are brought before the Shvira, Ubazeh, and from that source is Hamshacha L'Yadin, a power is given to the Jordan, Sheyucha L'Halas, that it should be able to elevate, V'lital Mizeh, V'litin Lazeh, to take from one and give to the next, V'dai L'Maven, V'Maven Yavin. It's enough to understand, and if smart you will. Some are going to argue that Vidal and V'Maven Yavin are Stidim and Eobei. If it's easy to understand, then you don't have to be a maven. If you have to be a maven, why is it Vidal? We'll all do that for homework because I have no clue. So the Maimon is saying there's limitation in all systems, and that the source of the ability to bring godliness and to change and godlify, if you will, the entire reality is because of a godliness which is higher than the limitations of the creation, that's Veyarad Hagvul, which comes down through the Gavul. This is the Maamar of the Alter Rebbe. That's it, 19 lines. How we managed to make that into 45 minutes, I think you know by now that we have no trouble finding words. We may have some difficulty finding contained words, but words, no shortage. I suspect that this is a Maamar from before Peterburg. It's an old Maamar because of the size and also because of the abstractness. You read this Maamar without the commentary, it either seems impossible to comprehend or very, very, very simple. You don't see any depth. The commentary which follows, which the Alter Rebbe said subsequent to the Maamar itself, reveals what he was trying to say, and you discover that besides for the simple, practical aspect of the Maamar, there's the profound mysticism associated with it. Now, we're not going to learn the whole Maamar. We're going to learn only one idea, the concept of limitation. And Veyarad Hagvul means you bring limitation into Yarden, you bring limitation into Yam Kinneret. That makes them a world, that makes them function. So let's begin. I'd like to explain, says Alter Rebbe, the meaning of the concept of Veyarad Hagvul. That in order for there to be a world, in order for it to be Birurim, in order for it to be Torah in the real world, you have to have Veyarad Hagvul. Says the Rebbe that this goes in the Al-Ruchas Eretz Yisrael. Physically, it's an allusion to the borders of the Holy Land, which are 4. Yeshloi, says the Rebbe, I would like to posit that these 4 borders of Eretz Yisrael in mystical language are Shu Inyan Beis Givuli Alachna Niske B'Sefer Yetzirah. It's the 12 meeting points of borders that are discussed in the Sefer Yetzirah. Here, take a look at this box. How many places in this box are 2 dimensions meeting, right? There are 3 dimensions. 3 dimensions means 6 sides. A top, a bottom, a right, a left, a front, and a back. How many places of meeting do you have between any 2 dimensions? The answer is 12. Watch. Here's 1. Here's another. Here's a third. And here's a 4th, right? Now repeat the same thing at the bottom. Here is 1. Here's another. Here's a 3rd. And here's a 4th. And then, of course, here is 1. Here is another. Here is another. And here is another. In other words, you have 6 sides. There are 12 places where each one of these sides meets a different side. It is the meeting between one side and another side which creates complexity and containment, in other words, creates reality. Think about this in simple common sense. Okay, I'm going to ask a question. Okay, how vast is the East? How big is the East? The answer is the East doesn't exist. There's no such thing as an East. It's nothing, unless there's a West. When you have an East and a West, it is the West that makes the East spatial. because it's not relating to the West. The East alone is in theory. Like, how much space does one dimension occupy? 0. How much space does 2 dimensions occupy? 0. How much space does 3 dimensions occupy? You can measure it. Now wait, how could 0 times 0 equal something? And the answer is, this is not physical, this is philosophical. The 0 dimensions, the 1 dimension and the 2 dimension exist in theory because they are infinite. Because they're not relating, and what I mean when I say infinite is, they're not relating to something other than themselves. If they're not related to something other than themselves, they are simple. If they're simple, they're wonderful to themselves, but something other than themselves has no relationship with them. Only when you give East a relationship to West, when you give East a relationship to West, you're not only translating East to itself and translating West to itself, you're making East and West real enough to have a translation for us. So that's the concept of Gevul Alachsein. Alachsein literally means a diagonal line, but I think we're going to translate Alachsein as dimensions. Gevul Alachsein means the borders of dimensions. We think of universe, as we should, as globular, as being a ball. Not a box, but it makes very little difference. It's just, a ball is an incomplete square, as it were, but it's, in Theta language, approximately 3/4 of a square. But the reality is you have sides. You have a top and a bottom, an east and a west, a north and a south, and so forth. And it is real because they meet. If the top didn't meet any side, the top would not exist because it would have no depth. If any one side would not meet the other side, the top and the bottom, it would not exist because it takes up no space. It's a theory, it's a concept. It's the relationship between the top of this box and the right side of the box that creates actual dimension. In other words, actual space. And always actual space is limited space. So one dimension either is nothing or infinite, and they're very similar. It is the multiple dimensions and their relatedness that creates the limitation of space. That's the concept of Gevul Alachsein. The meeting point of dimensions creates the reality. If you wanted to use an example from a person, although it's not a perfect example, because you have hands and feet and eyes and ears and a nose and a mouth, you're a person. The eyes by themselves are not a person. The hands by themselves are not a person. It's the combination. It's the meetings. The eyes are not only eyes in a human body. The arms, not only arms in the human body, they're part of being human. That complexity is limitation and reality and function. Each thing by itself, the eye by itself, is nothing or infinite, but has no relationship to anything but itself. It's not a reality. So this Maamar says, Veyarad Hagvul, to have a reality that needs to be corrected, to engage in the correction of that reality, to impose on that reality something which is above correction, namely the Torah. The prerequisite to all of those things are gvul, limitation. Now, on one level, of course, this argument is saying that the way Hashem created His world, in order to reveal godliness in this world, it has to be limited. But on a deeper level, we're saying is that through that limitation, you're able to meet infinity. And the key word in that statement, through limitation, you're able to meet infinity, is the word meet. Meet means a connection between two things, which alternatively can be articulated as pnimius, godliness entering into a vessel in a pnimius way. That cannot happen if you don't have limitation. Godliness is becoming one with something which is ungodly, and ultimately the very essence of godliness, Yossi is being contained within that vessel. If you don't have limitation, all that's impossible. And that's the philosophical argument to say that that finity, in a way, is closer to the truth than infinity, because that's how you meet the truth. So the Rebbe is going to explain this concept of limitation that I just shared with you and argue, Veyarad Hagvul, if there's no limitation, there's no world, there's no birurim, there's no Torah. And when you have a Veyarad Hagvul, it affects Yam Kineret, which is godliness that's perfect, and it affects Yarden, which is the concept of Birur, and of course it also affects Canaan, which is the klipa prior to the Birur. So let's read it inside. Let's now explain this pasuk of Veyarad Hagvul. You have to import limitation. On the surface, limitation means the borders of the Holy Land. Yeshlema, says Rabbi, I would like to interpret this to mean the 12 meeting points of the dimensions. That's my translation. You don't like it? Disagree. You can scream at the machine as loud as you want. You will not disturb me. Just don't disturb yourself. Which is mentioned in Sefer Yetzirah, or Pirush and Pardes. And the Pardes explains this. I actually looked it up. I'm not a genius. That's how I knew how to explain it. I looked up the Pardes. Shachaval Perek Zayin. Shem Gevul Mizrachas Remes. The meeting of east and above. Gevul Tzveinis Remes. North and above. V'chulu. And so forth. Gvul Mizrachis Tachtis, the east and what is below. V'chul. Gvul Mizrachis Tzveinis, the meeting of east and north. V'chulu Ayin Shav. I showed you with the box. I'm not going to repeat the visual. It's very simple. You have 4 meetings between the top and the sides, 4 meetings in the top between the bottom and the sides, and then the 4 meetings of the sides themselves. That's 12. And this is a Kabbalistic idea. And the Kabbalistic idea is that it is through this complexity. Complex means more than one, a hybrid of 2 things together, where each one offsets and limits the other, that reality emerges. The mystical depth of this, however, is that the opposite of 12 is 6. Because the 6 midas of Atzilus, 6 is quite complex in itself, are Ein Sof. Chesed of Atzilus by itself is infinite. Infinite kindness exists only in theory and is useless in the real world. Gevura of Atzilus is infinite Gevura, whatever Gevura means, and it exists only in theory, it's useless in the real world. A hybrid of Chesed and Gevura is limited, because Chesed limits Gevura, Gevura limits Chesed. That has a connection to the real world. That is the foundation of the real world. It's the beginning of the real world. So, if you were a mystic keeping score at home, this is what you would need to say. There is the pnimius of the 6 meters of Atzilus, and there's the chitzonius of the 6 meters of Atzilus. And the difference is, the pnimius of the 6 meters of Atzilus is each one is by themselves. It's infinite, it's theoretical, it's not a world. There is the chitzonius, which is the gilui. How do the meters of Atzilus reveal themselves? How does infinity come down? And the answer is, Veyarad Hagvul, by becoming complicated, by becoming qualified by its counterpart. Chesed works only with a little Gevura. Gevura works only with a little Chesed. So the 6 meters are absolute and not a world. 12 is the minimum complicating of those 6 absolutes to have a relationship with the world. That's the Kabbalistic concept of Yud Beis Gevuli Alachsan, which comes up in Chassidus periodically. And again, for the Kabbalists keeping score at home, this is Pnimius Hamidus and Chitzonius Hamidus. Though we talk about the limitation of the physical earth, there's no concept of above. I don't know what this means, frankly. Still, the root of our physical dimensions is nimshachu meyud beis gvuli alachsan anal. In Atzilus, in Kabbalah, there is a concept of 12 meetings of dimensions. Meeting of dimension means 2 things coming together. 2 things coming together complicates things and gives limitation to things. The physical dimensions and the physical limitations have to do with those limitations as well. I think that when he says in physically you don't have a dimensions, it's because the world is a globe as opposed to a cube. But I don't know. 24 now, line 24. We also find that Eretz Yisrael was divided up into 12 borders. The disc goes under the Yud Beis Shvat into 12 tribes. And of course, this is not just coincidental. This is precise. Why are there 12 tribes? Because 12 tribes, in a certain sense, represent a body, a reality. Complicated and contained, limited. That's a nation. And the 12 Shvatim correspond to the Yud Beis Gvuli Alachsan of Atzilus. That is known to Yud Beis Shvatim, that the 12 tribes, Shorsham, Gamken, their original source, mystically speaking, is Yud Beis Gvuli Alachsan, from the 12 meeting points of different dimensions. In other words, the beginning of reality is the beginning of complexity. And the beginning of complexity is Yud Beis Gevurah Alachsen. That's why down here there were 12 tribes. The 12 tribes are Treisar Tchumen Chula, the 12 borders. Now there are no 12 borders, only 6 borders. But there are 12 meeting points between the borders. And as I described to you before, how vast is the east? And the answer is it doesn't exist unless there's a west or a north and a south. And that's what Tchumen means. The relatedness between different borders that creates the reality, but always limited reality. Ilana Ilah Kadisha, because the supernal holy tree, Eitz Hadas, in other words, Behu Achtam B'Chaismahi, on it's sealed with its seal. The 6 midas of Atzilus are sealed on the 12 tribes. Now, the Rebbe here does something very interesting. He's Magia the Zohar. He says the Zohar needs to be corrected. V'zehu al derech ma shekasuv bepardes shar chaval perik vav, like it says in the Pardes, b'shem Sefer Aboyer, in the name of Sefer Aboyer, Ilan echad esher Baruch Hashem has one tree, Eitz Hadas, the 6 midas, u'ba Yud Beis Gevurah Alachsen v'chulu, and on a lower level those 6 become 12. That's the basis for limitation and complexity. Says the Rebbe, Ugvul, and you'll see in a moment the correction the Rebbe makes. Ugvul utchum inyan echad hu. The concept of a limitation and the concept of a border and one are the same thing. Line 28 now. And the reason we call it limits and borders is as follows. In line 28. The notion of these 12 meeting of dimensions is when you have an integrating, a meeting of 2 things, a complicating of Havav K'tzavas, the 6 midas. But the 6 midas are absolute. The 6 attributes in Atzilus of Chesed, Gevurah, Teferes. Netzach, Chanin, Yossi. When they're integrated, included with one another. For example, his Skalalus Hachasodim Begevurah is integrating kindness and severity. Only then is it a manifest kindness. All your scholars would have been integrating exactitude with aggressiveness. Then it's functional. All your scholars are covered with integration of the various different poles. Ki chachan is kava yamin. Chochma chesed netzach is to the right. Ubagor kava smel. Bina gevurah hayd is to the left. And each one by themselves is polar. Polar means infinite and useless, or non-existent. When they're integrating, they're sharing, is why they is the places of meeting between one and the next. Those places of meeting limit, those places of meeting give body, they give form, they create the reality of the dimensions rather than the theory of the dimensions, and it's always limited and always complicated. This integration and this limiting and this complicating can't happen in the level of a light that exists in essence, in relationship with itself. Chesed by itself is infinite and nothing. Gevurah by itself is infinite and nothing. It's the meeting that creates the limitation and the reality. The light is plain. The light goes into vessels. And said slightly differently. When one light meets a different light, which is the basis for the integrating of chesed begevurah, or netzach v'chulu, kifei seder ha'anaga, in as much as Hashem governs His world. Through the vessels, you have a meeting of chesed and gevurah. Without the vessels, chesed is absolute, gevurah is absolute, teferes is absolute. It's wonderful and useless. Line 33. V'hine. Hakelim hei magbilim. The vessels create the limitation in the light and the complicating of the light. Sha'oir nigbal b'kli. The light becomes limited through the vessels. Hein mitzad sha'eiru er pashat, because the light by itself is plain. V'nigbal b'keli, and it only becomes limited and formed through the vessels. Li'esmachayu mahava kli chesed, to give life and reality to the vessel of chesed. Imkein hakeli magbilasi. It is the vessel that affects a limitation in the light. And understand, giving a limitation means giving reality. As well as the fact that the light by itself is infinite, v'hakeli magbelis, and the vessel limits, that it should be limited. So one thing is the light is plain, the other thing is the light is infinite, and the vessel accommodates both of those things. And since the idea of this integration and complicating, Lias Nasa Yud Beis, that 6 should become 12, Yud Beis Bechira, 6 should become 12, only when the light goes into the vessels. Line 36. The light by itself, is an absolute light, which means a non-existent light, a non-relating light. They're called 12 borders, but borders means limitations, because the borders creates the reality, right? How big is an infinite table? This is a table, right? Which is 4 feet across, it's 3 feet wide. How big is an infinite table? The answer is an infinite table takes up no space. Yeah, but it's infinite. Precisely. It cannot be. It's the limitation and the relatedness of the dimensions, the ktsaves, that makes it real. Or you'd base Tchumen at 12 borders, Hainu Hagabolis, limitations, the light is limited by the vessels, Umiskalalim, it becomes integrated with other aspects, Yud Beis Gevulim, 12 limitations, Yud Beis Tchumen, 12 borders. Mashakosov B'Hazeyer, and the aforementioned Zeyer, says the Rebbe, that says, Deha Yilani Allah Kadisha, that this supernal tree, Eitz HaChaim, Behu Achtam B'Choismoi, is sealed with Hashem's seal, says the Rebbe Yesh Lafarshei. We have to figure out what that means. But I would like to make a Hagah in the Zeir. I would prefer to say, there's simply a typo, a mistake in the writing. What is itcham betchumoi, not sealed with its seal, but has its borders fixed. And when the borders are fixed, the Eitz HaChayim, the tree of life, has a relationship with the reality. As we explained before, line 40. And now the Rebbe goes on to say, this number 12, like the number 4 in some context, or like the number 2 in some other context, represent diversity, complexity, and containment, which is the basis for a reality. So he gives you a bunch of examples. These 12 concepts of complex containment. Are the 12 formations of Hashem's name. You can spell Havaya, Yud Kei Vav Kei, in 12 different ways. 12 different ways of spelling Adna. In other words, you can rearrange the letter in many different ways. That's why there are 12 months. In other words, the breakdown of division is rooted in this model. And the mystical source of it is that Hashem has 6 absolute midas, and you have to have a minimum of 12 for them to be functional. Each month, each month, the Jewish collective, the spiritual neshama of Yidden, receives a different energy from one of the 12 formations of the letters of Hashem's name. The limitation and complicating of the supernal midas. In Atzilos, like kindness with stubbornness, which is called the meeting of the dimensions of south and below, like Israel is the same way in what reaches Kansas Yisrael. Laved is Hashem to serve God. In this aspect, which is love by itself is infinite and dysfunctional. Stubbornness by itself, must I tell you, is infinite and dysfunctional. It is the meaning that is useful. Similarly, the meaning of Gevura with Haid, which also means stubbornness. Which is the meaning of the north and the bottom. It fuses fear of God with stubbornness in our relationship with God. It is true in all the attributes. Line 45 now. That's the mystical concept. Why is Israel limited? Answer: if Israel wasn't limited, Israel wouldn't exist. Simple. And of course, the spirituality behind it is there's a limited world that needs to be corrected through limitation, and a limited world which is above the need to correct, and it has to be superimposed on the limited world which has been corrected. Line 46. The very origin, the mystical source of the concept of complicating things and limiting things to create a reality is comes from even higher. So far, we've attributed this complicating and containing to chitzonius zo, the outer level of the midas. But now he wants to go even higher. And it descends lower into Malchus of Atzilus. It's true all over. Reality is limitation. Reality is, as that Chassid said an hour ago, you want to be functional, be deliberate and limiting. Limited sometimes is better than being impulsive. Not sometimes, always. And the real source of this limitation is not Zodat Silas, which is a Metzias, but Mikedem, from before, higher than the fountain. In other words, some Kesed. Over there, say Parshas Massei, it says in Zeyar, Teresa, this casting the 12 which are concealed. Also, this Melech Shaman, the Kabbalah explains what this is alluding, that Sheshar Shamit Tefer is the Arech. The beginning of these 12 is actually in Kesed. Because there are midas above Chochma and Bina, which Alter Rebbe calls in Tanya Turi the Chashecha. Ad da'ava amal bishan esam, that Chochma Bina becomes simple garments for the midas of Kesed, even though normally midas come from Seichel. These are midas which are l'mayla min ha-seichel. You make Kedem, as they're called, as opposed to you make Elam. Shem rak levush l'midas elu, that the Chochma Bina is a garment to the midas of Kesed. That's the truest place of Hiskalos. Umisham Yeda the Mishtalshal, from there it descends and evolves. But Yud basically alachs and the 12 diagonal lines, or the 12 meetings of the dimensions of the midas of Atziles. Chanin shagam came Malchus to come into Malchus. Mochal ketef Yam Kineret. They should bang against the ketef Yam Kineret, which here he's saying goes on Malchus, but as I understand it from later, that this is going in a Lakus, which is above Klipa. That the love should be one of the light. Mataka kiner, sweet as a kiner. Kineret means the sweet as a fiddle. And of course, the way we're understanding the Maamar, this goes on the body of godliness, namely Torah, which is above the body of the reality and above of the reality of Yarden, which is Avodas HaBirurim. This is tonight's class. Today's class. And Mr. Shem, next week we're going to learn the second half of the Maamar, where we're simply going to elaborate on what we said tonight and explain that you have limitation all over, and the source of the limitation comes from the highest levels, and it is that limitation that allows us to achieve Birurim and Gili Alakus, as I said to you before, Yashar Yechazu Fanemei.